Ethan Walker, a seasoned wildlife photographer, had spent the past week documenting the rugged beauty of the Montana wilderness. Early one morning, as the first rays of sunlight cut through the dense fog, he ventured deeper into the forest, camera in hand, searching for the perfect shot. The crisp air carried the faint scent of pine and damp earth, and the distant sounds of birds waking for the day created a symphony of nature. As he carefully maneuvered through the undergrowth, his trained eye caught an unusual disturbance in the foliage ahead. A trail of broken branches and scattered fur led him to a small clearing. His pulse quickened as he noticed something curled up against the base of a large pine tree, a bear cub. The cub's tawny fur was matted with dirt and streaked with blood. Its breathing was labored, and its small body trembled with exhaustion. Ethan's stomach clenched at the sight. He had witnessed the raw brutality of nature many times, but seeing a vulnerable creature in distress never failed to stir something deep within him. He took a cautious step forward, ensuring his movements were slow and deliberate. The cub's ears twitched, but it barely lifted its head. Its left flank bore deep gashes, evidence of a recent and vicious attack. The claw marks were unmistakable. This cub had been the target of a mountain lion. Ethan's mind raced through the possibilities. A mother bear would never leave her cub alone unless she had no choice. The lack of any fresh bear tracks nearby suggested that the mother was either dead or too injured to return. That meant this cub had been left to fend for itself, a near impossible feat in the unforgiving wilderness. Kneeling beside the cub, Ethan reached into his backpack for his water bottle. The cub's tongue flicked out, dry and cracked, as if sensing relief. Carefully, he poured a small amount into his palm and extended it toward the cub. At first, it didn't react, its energy seemingly drained. Then, after a long pause, it weakly lapped at the water. Encouraged, Ethan assessed the cub's injuries more closely. The wounds were fresh but not yet festering. However, dehydration and blood loss had clearly taken their toll. He knew he couldn't simply leave it there, but interfering with wildlife was a serious ethical and legal dilemma. His job was to document nature, not alter it. Yet, watching the cub struggle to breathe, its fragile body trembling from weakness, he knew that leaving it to die was not an option he could live with. His hands hovered over his camera, the tool that had defined his career. He was meant to capture moments, not change them. But this wasn't just another shot. It was a life hanging by a thread. His radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. "Ethan, you there?" It was Daniel, a fellow wildlife researcher stationed at a nearby observation post. Ethan hesitated before responding. "Yeah, I found a cub. Injured. Mountain lion attack, I think." A pause. Then Daniel's voice, laced with concern. "Is the mother around?" "No sign of her. The cub is in bad shape." A longer silence followed. Ethan knew what Daniel was going to say before he even said it. "You know the protocol, Ethan?" Ethan clenched his jaw. "I can't just leave it." Daniel sighed. "It's not our call to make. If it's orphaned and injured, the best bet is contacting wildlife rescue. But they won't get here for hours, maybe longer." Ethan looked down at the cub, which had closed its eyes again, its breathing shallower than before. Time was running out. "I'll stay with it," Ethan said firmly. "At least until help arrives." He ended the radio transmission before Daniel could argue further. Ethan reached into his pack again, this time for a small first aid kit. He wasn't a veterinarian, but he had basic field training. He dampened a clean cloth with water and gently wiped the dirt from the cub's wounds. The cub flinched but was too weak to resist. As he worked, he kept an ear out for any signs of danger. A wounded cub meant predators could be near, either the mountain lion that had attacked it or other scavengers drawn to the scent of blood. Minutes passed like hours. The cub remained still, its tiny body pressed against the earth. Ethan whispered to it, his voice low and soothing, though he doubted it understood. Maybe it was more for his own sake, to remind himself that he was doing the right thing. Then a rustle in the underbrush. Ethan froze, his heart hammering in his chest. His hand instinctively reached for his camera, but he knew that if another predator emerged, a photograph wouldn't save either of them. The forest fell silent again. Ethan exhaled slowly, scanning the shadows between the trees. There was nothing for now, but he knew they weren't alone. He refocused on the cub, noting the steady rise and fall of its chest. It was weak but still fighting. Ethan glanced toward the sky, gauging the time. If help didn't arrive soon, he'd have to make a difficult decision, one that would blur the lines between photographer and protector, observer and savior. The cub let out a soft, pitiful whimper. Ethan reached out, placing a reassuring hand near its paw. "Hang in there, little one," he murmured. "You're not alone." Ethan Walker stood frozen, his breath misting in the cold air as he stared down at the wounded cub. His body tensed with indecision, his thoughts circling the same impossible question over and over again. The rules were clear. Wildlife photographers and researchers were strictly forbidden from interfering with nature. It was the unshakable principle that guided every professional in his field. Document, but never disrupt. Observe, but never intervene. He had lived by that rule for years, had watched the cruel cycle of life and death unfold before him, had accepted that suffering was simply part of the wilderness. He had seen fawns taken by wolves, had captured the final, desperate struggles of elk trapped in frozen rivers, had even filmed a mother fox walking away from her dying kit because she couldn't afford to waste her energy on a pup that wouldn't survive. He had told himself, time and time again, that this was just how nature worked. But now, standing over the fragile, battered body of the cub, something inside him rebelled. The cub's breath was shallow, uneven. Its fur, once thick and soft, was caked with dried blood and dirt. The gashes along its side, deep, raw, evidence of a brutal fight, were starting to crust over, but infection would set in soon. It was weak, too weak to even lift its head. Its small, dark eyes, barely open, held no fear, no expectation, just emptiness. Ethan clenched his jaw, forcing himself to take a step back. He had to walk away. He knew that, but his feet wouldn't move. He stared at the cub, his chest tightening. If he left, it would die. That much was certain. If he saved it, he would break the rules. A cold gust of wind rushed through the trees, sending dead leaves skittering across the ground. Ethan barely noticed. His thoughts were locked in an internal battle, each side screaming at him with equal force. Walk away. This is not your place. Stay. If you do nothing, this cub dies alone. He had never interfered before. Not when he had watched a starving wolf struggle to keep up with its pack. Not when he had come across a young deer that had broken its leg, its panicked eyes darting around as it waited for the inevitable. He had forced himself to remain an observer because that was his role. But why did this feel different? He swallowed hard, rubbing a hand over his face. He wasn't supposed to care. That's what they taught you. To detach, to see the wild as it was, without human sentimentality clouding your judgment. And yet he cared. His stomach twisted, his pulse pounding in his ears. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, suffocating him. The right thing, the professional thing, was to leave. The human thing, the thing clawing at his insides, refusing to be silenced, was to stay. He thought of all the times he had let the camera act as a barrier, a way to separate himself from the brutality of nature. He had always told himself that it wasn't his job to interfere, that his duty was to document, to capture truth without becoming a part of it. But looking down at the cub, its tiny chest rising and falling in slow, fragile movements, Ethan felt like a coward. What kind of man could just walk away? His hands trembled as he clenched them into fists. He turned away for a moment, staring out into the trees, as if the answer would be hidden somewhere in the shadows. Was this really happening? Was he really going to do this? A voice in his mind whispered that he was being foolish, that this wasn't a fairy tale where he could swoop in and save the helpless creature without consequences. There would be fallout. If anyone found out, he could lose everything, his credibility, his career, everything he had worked for. But what was a career worth if he had to live with the image of this dying cub burned into his mind for the rest of his life? He inhaled sharply, his fingers twitching as he made his decision. A part of him still fought against it, still screamed that this was wrong, that he was betraying the very principles that had defined his work. But the rest of him, the part that had spent years witnessing death without being able to do a damn thing about it, refused to listen. Slowly, hesitantly, he crouched beside the cub. The moment his hands hovered near its fragile body, the final wall inside him crumbled. He was breaking the rules, but he didn't care anymore. Ethan Walker pressed forward, his breath a ragged whisper against the relentless wind as he climbed higher into the treacherous terrain. The bear cub lay draped over his back, its frail body wrapped in his fleece, its warmth barely noticeable against the biting chill that settled into his skin. Every muscle in his body protested, screaming for rest, for reprieve, but there was none to be found. The path ahead was nothing but jagged rock and uneven ground, a merciless incline that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the fading sky. The forest had begun to thin as he ascended, the towering pines giving way to sparser trees, their twisted limbs reaching out like skeletal fingers against the bruised horizon. His boots scraped against loose gravel, sending small stones tumbling down the mountainside, each one a cruel reminder of how little margin for error he had. One misstep, one moment of weakness, and he would fall, the cub along with him, swallowed by the unforgiving wilderness. The weight on his back was light, too light. The cub barely stirred, its breathing shallow, its fragile ribs pressing against Ethan's spine with every uncertain inhale. He had hoped for more signs of life, a flicker of strength, a small protest at being carried, anything that would tell him he wasn't too late, but all he could feel was stillness. Panic gnawed at the edges of his mind, but he forced it down. There was no room for fear. The only thing that mattered now was moving forward. The wind howled through the craggy outcrops above him, tearing through his jacket, slashing at the sweat that clung to his skin. The cold was worsening, the temperature dropping with every step he took toward the higher elevations, and his body was beginning to feel the effects of the relentless climb. His legs burned, leaden with exhaustion, his lungs a raw, aching hollow in his chest. His pack, though mostly empty now, cut into his shoulders, the straps digging into flesh already rubbed raw beneath the added burden of the cub. He shifted slightly, trying to ease the pressure, but it was useless. Every part of him hurt. The path grew steeper, narrowing into a cruel sliver of rock with nothing but open air on either side. Ethan's heart pounded as he placed one foot carefully in front of the other, his arms outstretched for balance. The wind battered against him, threatening to knock him sideways, and for a terrifying moment, he felt himself sway. His breath caught in his throat as his boot slid against a patch of loose stone, his knee buckling, the weight on his back shifting dangerously. His fingers scrabbled against the rough surface of the rock wall beside him, nails scraping against stone as he fought to steady himself. The cub let out a faint whimper, the first sound it had made in what felt like hours, and Ethan clenched his jaw, digging deep for the strength to push forward. He couldn't afford to fall. Not here. Not now. He forced his legs to move, slow and deliberate, every step a test of his endurance. His vision blurred at the edges, exhaustion creeping into his bones like a poison, but he refused to stop. The outpost was still miles away, hidden beyond the jagged peaks, and the cub wouldn't survive if he didn't make it there in time. He could feel time slipping away, each breath a reminder of how fragile the life on his back had become. The forest below had long since disappeared, replaced by the desolate silence of the high-altitude wilderness. There were no more birds, no rustling leaves, no comforting signs of life. Only the wind, the cold, and the endless, unyielding stone. It was the kind of place where only the strongest survived, where weakness was punished with swift, merciless indifference. Ethan had spent his life capturing the beauty of such places, but now he felt the full force of their cruelty. His mind drifted, slipping into the dangerous haze of fatigue. He thought of the rules he had broken, the career he had put on the line, the reputation he had spent years building now hanging in the balance. He thought of the times he had stood by and done nothing, convincing himself it was the right thing, the necessary thing. He had watched life fade from countless animals through the lens of his camera, had accepted the brutality of nature as something beyond his control. But this time he had chosen to act, and that choice had led him here, to this desperate, punishing climb, to the weight of a dying cub pressing against his back, to the growing certainty that he might not make it. A sound cut through the wind, sharp and low. Ethan froze, his pulse hammering in his throat. It came again, a deliberate crunch of movement against the stone. He turned his head slowly, his senses sharpening, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Eyes, gleaming, yellow, watching from the shadows of the rocks above. The mountain lion. It had been following him. Ethan's breath came faster, his fingers tightening instinctively at his sides. He had no weapon, no way to defend himself beyond his own body, and he was already weakened, drained by the climb. The cub on his back was a liability, an easy meal for a predator that had already proven its willingness to attack. The lion didn't move, only watched, its body coiled, its muscles tense beneath its tawny fur. It was waiting. Ethan knew what that meant. Predators were patient. They waited for weakness, for hesitation, for the perfect moment to strike. And Ethan, swaying on exhausted legs, burdened with a half-dead cub, was as vulnerable as he had ever been. His mind raced through his options. Running was out of the question. If he ran, the lion would chase. If he fought, he would lose. His only chance was to stand his ground. Slowly, deliberately, he straightened, widening his stance to make himself appear larger. He raised his arms, spreading them out, his heart slamming against his ribs as he met the lion's gaze with unwavering determination. The lion didn't flinch. Ethan took a step back. The lion tensed. He could hear his own heartbeat, thundering in his ears, drowning out the wind. Another step. The lion growled, a deep, guttural warning that sent ice through Ethan's veins. His hands trembled at his sides. His muscles coiled with the painful awareness that one wrong move would mean death. Another step. The lion exhaled sharply through its nose, its ears flicking back. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned. Ethan didn't move, didn't breathe, until the predator disappeared into the shadows. Only then did the weight of the moment crash into him, nearly buckling his knees. His body screamed for rest, but there was no time. Gritting his teeth, Ethan forced himself to keep going, dragging his exhausted body forward, step by punishing step. The cub needed him, and he would not fail. The first raindrop hit Ethan's cheek like ice, cutting through the heat of his exhaustion. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the sky cracked open, unleashing a relentless downpour that soaked through his clothes, chilling him to the bone. The wind roared through the mountain pass, carrying the scent of wet stone and pine, its howling voice almost mocking his struggle. The world around him blurred into a haze of gray and shadow as sheets of rain lashed against the rock, turning the treacherous path into a slick, unforgiving nightmare. The bear cub stirred weakly against his back, a faint tremor passing through its fragile body. Ethan felt the weight of it shift slightly, the warmth barely noticeable against the cold that was seeping into his muscles, into his bones. He had hoped for signs of strength, a small movement, anything, but the cub was fading, slipping further into whatever half-conscious state it had been trapped in since he first picked it up. Each mile had drained more life from it, and now, with the storm raging around them, its chances of survival were shrinking by the second. Ethan clenched his teeth, pushing forward. The rain turned the path into a slick death trap, mud and loose gravel shifting beneath his boots with every step. His body was beyond exhaustion, past the point of pain. It was simply running on instinct now, on sheer, stubborn will. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and desperation. His fingers had gone numb long ago, his grip on the cub's makeshift sling weakening, but he couldn't stop. Not here. Not now. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the jagged peaks in stark, ghostly flashes. The deafening crack of thunder followed, rolling through the mountains like a growl from the gods themselves. Ethan barely flinched. Fear had burned out of him hours ago, leaving nothing but raw determination and the crushing weight of responsibility. The cub needed him, and he had already sacrificed too much to fail now. But his body was failing him. His legs trembled with every step, his vision blurred at the edges, dark spots dancing in his peripheral. He could feel the slow creep of weakness settling in, the dangerous pull of exhaustion whispering at him to stop, to rest, to just let go. His breaths came ragged and shallow, his lungs burning, his heartbeat a dull, unsteady rhythm in his ears. His pack felt like a slab of concrete strapped to his back, dragging him down with every agonizing step forward. The cub let out the faintest whimper. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry despite the rain, his pulse stuttering. He adjusted his grip on the straps, trying to keep the cub as steady as possible, but the effort nearly cost him his balance. He stumbled, catching himself against the slick rock just in time to avoid going over the edge. His knees buckled, the sharp bite of stone digging into his palms as he braced himself against the ground. He couldn't keep this up. The realization hit him like a fist to the ribs. He wasn't just tired. He was at his limit. His body was shutting down. If he fell now, if he collapsed beneath the weight of his own exhaustion, there would be no getting back up. The storm was getting worse, the wind clawing at him, the rain turning everything into a treacherous, shifting maze of mud and stone. The cub stirred again, weaker this time. Ethan forced himself to move, to rise, to keep going. But his limbs were sluggish, his strength slipping away faster than he could hold on to it. His body screamed for rest, for relief, for an end. And in that moment, he finally allowed himself to wonder. Had he made a mistake? Had he doomed them both? A raw, helpless anger burned in his chest, fueling one final push forward. He wasn't going to die here, and neither was the cub. He had carried it through the mountains, faced down predators, battled his own breaking body, and now he was going to let some goddamn storm take them out? No, not like this. A deep, ragged breath. Another step, then another. The cub pressed against him, its warmth barely there, but somehow its presence grounded him. He could feel the faint rise and fall of its breath, fragile but still fighting. The bond between them had been unspoken from the start. He had carried it, protected it, fought for it without expecting anything in return. But now, as the storm raged on, as exhaustion threatened to consume them both, something shifted. The cub was trusting him, relying on him completely. And Ethan realized, with a startling clarity, that he was relying on it too. They were in this together. He clenched his jaw, wiping rain from his eyes, and kept moving, step by step, breath by breath. The storm screamed around him, the cold gnawed at his bones, but he refused to stop. The cub whimpered softly, and Ethan whispered back, his voice hoarse but steady. "We're gonna make it. You hear me?" The wind swallowed his words, but it didn't matter. He wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. The fluorescent lights of the clinic were harsh, sterile, humming softly above Ethan as he stood motionless just beyond the treatment room's doorway. His clothes were soaked through, mud-caked, and stiff against his skin, his body numb from exhaustion and the cold that had settled deep in his bones. His muscles had long since burned out, his arms hanging limp at his sides, his legs barely holding him upright. But none of that mattered. His eyes remained locked on the small, battered form lying on the metal table, surrounded by a flurry of hands, voices sharp and urgent. The bear cub, fragile and unmoving, was slipping further away, and he could do nothing but watch. Dr. Olivia Carter moved with the precision of someone who had seen too much suffering, her dark eyes sharp and unwavering as she examined the wounds along the cub's ribcage. Her team worked in near silence. The only sounds the beep of monitors, the rustling of gloves, the clink of instruments against steel trays. Every second stretched unbearably, each moment another chance for the cub's life to slip through their fingers. "BP is dropping," one of the techs called out, his voice tight with urgency. "Give me another line," Olivia snapped without looking up, her hands already moving to stabilize the cub's failing body. Her jaw was set, her focus razor-sharp, but Ethan could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she pressed just a little too hard against the cub's side, as if trying to will it to hold on. Ethan wanted to say something, anything, but the words lodged in his throat. He had carried this tiny, dying thing through the mountains, through storms and exhaustion, had fought his own body's collapse to keep it alive, and now he was powerless. He had thought the hardest part was over, that getting here meant survival. But as he watched the monitors flicker and the cub's breath grow weaker, he realized how wrong he had been. The fight was still happening. He just wasn't the one fighting anymore. One of the nurses reached for an oxygen mask, pressing it gently over the cub's nose. The machine hissed softly as oxygen flowed through the tube, the cub's small chest barely rising in response. Olivia swore under her breath. "Come on, come on." The cub didn't move. Ethan felt his hands clench into fists at his sides, his nails biting into his palms, but he welcomed the sting. He needed something to keep himself anchored because every part of him wanted to push forward, to do something, to take back control. But there was nothing left for him to do. He had carried it this far, and now its survival was in their hands. Olivia glanced up at him for the first time since he'd arrived, her expression unreadable. "You carried it all the way here?" He nodded, unable to find his voice. Her gaze flicked back to the cub, and for the briefest second, something in her hardened face softened. But then the moment was gone, replaced by the cold efficiency of a doctor in crisis mode. Give it fluids, another round of antibiotics, and keep that oxygen steady. Another nurse moved quickly to adjust the four, the clear liquid dripping too slowly, too insignificantly to ease the panic rising in Ethan's chest. He had spent hours keeping this cub alive, fighting for every breath it took, and now all he could do was stand there and watch it slip closer to the edge. The storm outside hadn't let up. Rain pounded against the clinic windows, rattling against the glass like impatient fingers tapping a warning. It felt cruel, like the world was reminding him how fragile this life was, how easily nature could reclaim what it had nearly lost. A long, tense silence stretched between them. The cub's body remained limp, its breathing shallow. And then, a flicker of movement. Ethan barely breathed as he saw it. A twitch, a faint, almost imperceptible shift of the cub's paw, its claws curling slightly against the sterile, white sheet beneath it. The air in the room seemed to thicken as everyone stilled, waiting, watching. The cub stirred again, its body weak, trembling, but alive. A slow, relieved exhale escaped Olivia's lips. "There you go, little one." The tension in the room broke, subtle but present. The tech who had been monitoring the heart rate finally leaned back, the tightness in his face easing just slightly. One of the nurses allowed herself a small smile before returning to her work. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It wasn't over. Not yet. But the cub had chosen to fight. He let himself sink into one of the stiff plastic chairs against the wall, his body finally acknowledging the sheer weight of exhaustion dragging him down. His hands trembled as he wiped the rain from his face, his limbs too heavy, too slow. Olivia peeled off her gloves, rolling her stiff shoulders before stepping toward him. "It's not out of the woods yet," she said quietly, her voice steady but not unkind. "It's dehydrated, malnourished, and those wounds are deep. But it's fighting." Ethan nodded, swallowing against the lump in his throat. He didn't trust himself to speak. She studied him for a long moment before sighing, rubbing a hand across her forehead. "I don't know what you risked to bring it here, but I can tell you it was a lot. You look like hell." A hoarse chuckle escaped him, too dry to be anything but exhaustion given sound. "I feel worse." She didn't smile, but her gaze softened just a little before she turned back to her team, issuing more instructions, ensuring that every possible measure was being taken. Ethan barely heard the words. The world around him had started to blur at the edges, fatigue sinking into every part of him. But he didn't move. He couldn't. His body screamed for rest, for warmth, for sleep that wouldn't come in fractured, adrenaline-fueled bursts. But he wasn't leaving. Not yet. He had carried that cub through hell, had fought every obstacle nature had thrown at him, had ignored every voice in his head that had told him to give up, to turn back. He had broken rules, put everything on the line, and for what? A chance, a fragile, fleeting chance. And now, as the storm raged on outside and the clinic's machines hummed with the steady rhythm of the cub's breathing, Ethan finally let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, it had been enough. The morning air was sharp and cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine as Ethan Walker stood at the edge of the wildlife reserve, watching the small transport crate shift slightly on the bed of the pickup truck. Inside, the bear cub, no longer the fragile, dying creature he had carried through the storm, was restless, its paws scraping against the metal floor, its breathing fast and eager. Months had passed since that brutal night in the mountains, months filled with quiet battles and uncertain victories. But now, here they were at the final moment. The cub was ready. Ethan wasn't sure if he was. Dr. Olivia Carter stood beside him, arms crossed over her chest, her sharp eyes locked on the crate, as if willing herself not to second-guess their decision. She had been the one to fight for the cub's survival, to patch it up, to monitor every shift in its condition, to push through the long, grueling days when it seemed the little thing wouldn't make it. It had taken weeks before it could even stand properly, and even longer before it began showing signs of real strength. But as much as Olivia prided herself on maintaining a professional detachment, Ethan could see the faint crease of hesitation in her brow. "He's strong enough," she said finally, though her tone suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as anyone else. "He'll be fine." Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. Yeah, it should have felt like a victory, a moment of triumph after everything they had fought through. But as Olivia gestured for the wildlife officer to open the crate, Ethan felt a strange, hollow ache settle deep in his chest. He had spent so much time fighting for this moment, for the cub to have another chance at the life it had nearly lost. But now, as it stood at the threshold of freedom, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing something in the process. The metal door unlatched with a soft click. For a few long, breathless seconds, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the cub emerged. It was larger now, its body stronger, leaner, no longer the helpless creature Ethan had found bleeding in the dirt. Its fur had thickened, its muscles had filled out, and though it was still small for its age, it no longer looked fragile. It moved carefully, cautiously, sniffing at the air as if testing the unfamiliar sense of its new home. Ethan barely breathed. The cub took a few hesitant steps forward, its paws pressing into the damp earth. It stopped once, ears twitching at the sound of birds overhead, its body tense, ready to bolt if something felt wrong. Instinct was taking over now, the pull of the wild already sinking into its bones. This was where it was meant to be. And yet, just as it reached the edge of the clearing, just as it should have disappeared into the dense wall of trees without a second thought, it hesitated. Ethan's chest tightened as the cub turned its head ever so slightly, its dark eyes meeting his one last time. It was only for a moment, a fleeting, lingering second that stretched impossibly long, but Ethan felt it all the way down to his core. There was no fear in the cub's gaze, no confusion, no desperation, just recognition. Quiet, steady, almost grateful. Ethan swallowed hard. Then, without another sound, the cub turned and slipped into the forest, vanishing into the endless stretch of green. Ethan stood there for a long time after it was gone. The world around him felt quieter, the air heavier. It was done. The cub was free. He had done what he set out to do. So, why did it feel like something had been torn from him? A hand landed on his shoulder, grounding him. "Olivia, you did good," she said softly. And for the first time since they had met, there was something warmer in her voice, something that cut through the exhaustion, the doubt, the ache. Ethan let out a breath, staring at the place where the cub had disappeared. "Yeah," he murmured. "I hope so."